If you ask me which hero would I think is the worst design currently, I would have two answers. The worst gameplay design when it comes to what you would expect from a hero to play based on their theme and visuals would go to Orisa 100%, but even then there are some very interesting aspects like her weapon and overheat and ultimate that I find really interesting. She's quite popular, and while she's somewhat frustrating, especially when you play into her every game, she still has general counterplay that's accessible for most heroes. Now, the worst kit design by the kit itself would absolutely go for today's episode protagonist, Roadhog. He has been changed multiple times and even got a full rework, yet the problems while playing with and against the Hog are as bad, if not even worse, as they have been during Overwatch 1. Never one has Blizzard allowed him to be actual meta for more than like a month due to how toxic he makes the game experience and the way he makes everything and everyone warp around him during that period. As a disclaimer, if any information here is wrong, send it in the comments, as Hog has received so many changes around his hook that it's quite hard to tell when he could do certain things with it. Also, remember to subscribe and leave a like if you enjoyed the video, it helps me a ton. To start with, let's go over Hog's release. Hog's original kit was quite different from the current one. First off, he had two weapon modes. His primary fire was a regular shotgun, kind of how it works right now, while his secondary fire would shoot a projectile that would explode after a short distance and then spread like a shotgun. Basically, he had a short range and a mid range shotgun. His self-healing not only was a cooldown rather than a meter, but he also had no damage reduction and forced him to be stuck in place, which was overall more common in the slower pace of release Overwatch, where heroes like D.Va, Rein, Bastion and whatnot barely could move around without using specific movement abilities. His hook was essentially the same as now, with a major difference I will mention later, and he did not have his trap. His ultimate was not a transformation and was able to be cancelled at any moment by hard CC, while he wasn't allowed to use any other abilities. The original kit was absurdly fun to go against, and he was literally living or dying whether he hit the hook or not. He had a very low cooldown, it would pull people literally in front of you, and he would reliably one-shot everyone that wasn't a tank and even destroy tanks themselves. But since his vape was a pretty mediocre ability, you basically only had your HP as your tankiness, which was enough at that point, to be honest. What made him even more annoying for most players is that on release there was no hero limit, so people would just play whatever being usually 60 PS, meaning a Hog player could implode in 1 second, but he would also one-shot anyone even remotely close to him. The hitbox of the hook was very buggy and huge, which made it easy to hit even for the awful players at the beginning of Overwatch's lifetime. His shotgun was even worse at dealing consistent damage, as it had more spread, less ammo and fire rate. Another small oversight is that he would charge ults absurdly fast and would get a fat nerf to his charge rate quickly. Now, the worst feature of his hook, which would later be described as 1.0 hook, is that it would never break and would easily hit you around corners, leaving unfair scenarios that very quickly made him one of the most rage-inducing heroes of the game. We would already know the issues surrounding Hog that will stay to this day. You get a hook? Nice. You don't, he's absolute garbage, as the hook was and still is one of the most frustrating abilities in the entire game. Hooks in PvE games tend to be somewhat frustrating, but MOBAs, for example, tend to have minions that help you play around them, or they have more telegraphed cast times like Pike in League or Winter Soldiers in Rivals. Hooks is instant, and at this moment in time meant an instant death. There weren't even many abilities that could counter it. D.Va had Matrix, but she was basically unplayed during this time, so Zarya bubbles were the only reliable answer. And maybe Thor's armor pack, but again, also not popular at all. You could stun him, but most of them were very short range or on ultimates, meaning it was either risky or just not possible, as Hog could easily stay just outside the stun range. There was no immortality field, no Susu, and so on. The fact he also was the only tank with no defensive utility for allies would also mean that for most players he was just a fat DPS with a ton of HP, as hard CC wasn't even as exclusive for tanks as it is now. So you wouldn't even want to have one on your team, as he would just take every resource as possible from your team supports, and the possibility that he's good at one-shotting half the lobby. The thing, or well, hero that exposed all of these issues to a huge extent was Ana, who came out shortly after the game released, able to completely nullify his self-heal, as well as being one of the few heroes who could not only sleep him to deny his ult, but if you had good reactions could also be able to cancel some hooks and even his healing. At the same time, Ana existing overall increased the healing in the game, making Hog's ability to self-heal much less important, as a Reinhardt backed by Ana would not only provide much more utility, but he would also be able to sustain a Hog easily. Blizzard will try to alleviate this by nerfing his damage and one-shot potential, especially on tanks, because yeah, he could technically even one-shot a Zarya at some point in the beta, while making his weapon a lot more reliable. They would also make it a lot less buggy overall, which is a lie. This was still buggy as hell, leading to the 2.0 hook, which I don't remember the exact issues with this version. I believe this one allowed you to actually extend the stun duration but just flicking your camera like a madman, and it also just didn't work sometimes. But it's pretty hard to find accurate information, and I never was a Hog player. With this not being enough to reduce frustration, Blizzard decided to go actually hard on him and now actually remove his one-shot on most squishy heroes. They did in exchange is to make his weapon more consistent, and now he couldn't kill 200 HP heroes with small hitboxes that allowed a window for heroes like Genji to get away. This also did make his tank busting a bit worse, since before he would basically delete most tanks in 3 hours by doing an alternate fire, hook, and then primary fire, so at least it was a class of heroes that had actual counterplay around him. During this time there would be very bad and very good news for him. The bad one is that D.Va got a rework, making his one-shot very hard to pull off against good players, since Matrix was now meter-based with a short cooldown, while the good news is the release of Orisa, who would become his best partner for all of the remaining of Overwatch 1. If you only played since Overwatch 2 came out, you may be wondering why. This is because Orisa had an ability called Hold, which would pull players towards it, making it very easy to combo into hook. This duo was especially popular in low ranks when defending, where I was too hard to pull off, and as you can imagine, it wasn't like at all, as Orisa would just spawn shields a day to cover for Hog's weaknesses, while letting him heal safely. You would basically just play for those one-shots that were easy to counter in high reloads, but the uncoordinated mess that was Overwatch during that time made this combo obnoxious for the casual player. Some months after, they finally let him heal while moving and adding the damage reaction. This was made with intention to let him play outside the Orisa scenario while making him tankier. They also buffed Orisa at that time, since Dai was dominating at high elo, and this combo would see almost no play. This change did also allow Hog to finally have some survivability, especially against Ana, but realistically the fact he could move just made it a lot easier to use and more comfortable as a whole for the Hog player. Should have they nerfed the healing as the effect combined just made him unkillable for most heroes that weren't Ana? Maybe. And he will become one of the core of the other meta that was quad tank. Yeah, this was a thing for a while. Before goats emerged as the most broken comp, the idea of tanks and support just being superior from DPS, well, came from this comp, where you would just run 4 tanks and 2 supports, as most DPS simply didn't deal enough damage to be able to take them down. But he wouldn't see much play after due to Goats and Brick's release, who basically notified him in every scenario. Armor Pack easily denied his hook damage, and so did her stun if she was close enough, which was also able to deny his ultimate and his healing. Her shield just made it so Hog couldn't hook her that much, and even if he did, she was one of the few who could realistically survive most of the time. It was a really bad time for Hog players, and it's so funny how his poor design dictates how good or bad he is to such an extreme. Can he hook people and kill them? Good. Can he not? He's bad. He provided no value elsewhere, and even his ultimate was one of the worst ones when competing with Shatter or Primal. Blizzard didn't even intend to try to fix any of these issues, as they were very conservative when it came to kit changes, and since he technically had a good amount of dedicated players, they were just scared to really do much, as they could just lose all of them instantly, even if it came at the cost of the game quality of any match he was in. If you didn't play any of his counter, Blizzard's answer was just to get good and to learn their counters, as counter swapping as a whole was something encouraged during the first years of the game, as we have visited in prior episodes. He did receive some other change in terms of consistency during GOATs, as he wasn't viable in any competitive play, which didn't directly do much, but they would eventually lead to an Orisa Hog meta that was short-lived due to Sigma's release. Now Orisa had a better partner who not only was able to provide much more consistent utility, while still technically being able to one-shot with a rock into primary combo, but directly counter Hog, not only with his shield but his grasp would also block physical projectiles like his hook for some months. So we yet again ask the question, can Roadhog hook people? No, so how good is he? Horrible, of course. Double shield meta did not last nearly as long as Goats did, which perfectly lined up with Orisa Hog resurgence. Not only he could now hook Sigma while grasping, but he was also quite good at destroying the now weakened shields with his primary weapon receiving a huge damage buff, which made it quite possible to use the combo mentioned some time ago to even one-shot tanks, and before heroes who could barely survive his one-shot due to hitbox inconsistencies now stand no chance. Heck, even the tanky DPS like Mei had no chance to survive. It was the best he ever was during Overwatch 1, even being the clear best tank duo in high ranks with Orisa, which just so coincidentally happened when one-shots were being heavily discussed, with Hanzo, Doom and Hog being heroes that no one wanted to be meta, as they mostly were very easy to pull off, lack counterplay with the usual answers being supposedly terrible, and overall wasn't fun to play against. This doesn't mean Hog was fun to play into before, he simply wasn't popular enough for people to care, and even before, usually people would just say play behind the shield, Now that shields were overall pretty bad, well, everyone wanted him dead. Even if you did have a Hog in your team, it wasn't enjoyable for the exact same reasons that it wasn't enjoyable years ago. That being said, Blizz would just move around this number a bit, where you would also need to land his melee to one-shot, leading to a small window where you weren't stunned and could do something, but much smaller than just not getting one-shot by the combo. So he was just allowed to be strong by the end of the game's lifetime, to a point where Hog Orisa was meta. Yeah, weird times. He received a passive close to the end of the original Overwatch, now charging less ultimate to the enemy. The intention was good, as he was always called just an old battery whenever he couldn't land a hook, but overall these changes didn't actually change much of the feel of going against or with a Hog. Another honorable mention was the Ball's release, which worked as you imagine. Ball will go in, slam, and lead to an easy hook. Ball just wasn't popular at any time as far as I can remember, but it was a very strong and annoying combo. It also made counterpicking Hog harder, as the enemy Sombra or Ana had to choose whether to CC the Hog or the Ball. Now with the release of Overwatch 2, Blizzard clearly had Hog in mind when it came to the 5v5 transition. Not only were they reducing one-shots, but Tyches as a whole needed new tools to move around and support their teams by themselves. The super selfish playstyle of Hog simply wasn't compatible with how tanks were now meant to be played, so surely Blizzard was going to finally rework Hog. They only changed his ultimate to a transformation one. To this day, I can't even begin to comprehend in whose sane mind was Hog able to release in this state for Overwatch 2. I understand that Blizzard was in a hurry, and they did rework some other heroes, but truthfully, they gave him the death sentence by just barely changing anything about him. He had no way of providing any utility or pressure besides, hey, I can one-shot you, ooh, which made him the worst teammate ever. The overall reduction on hard CC also made him much harder to counter by non-tank heroes, who could also not interrupt his healing nor his hook. On the start of the first season, he actually went pretty unnoticed due to how broken D.Va and Zarya were, which were some of the few that could prevent his one-shot, but shortly after their nerfs, he became not only the best, but also the most popular tank in the game. The entire meta warped around him with the release of Kiriko. Suddenly, the old answers weren't actually working. She could cleanse Nade, which was the only way for him to be actually killed, as now both support would just need to keep him alive and not another tank, which let me tell you, was not fun to do, and the Hog player just ran around fishing for one-shots like it was nothing. He was already questionable during Overwatch 1, but he was simply not compatible with the way Overwatch 2 was meant to be played. One-shots were even stronger since there was one less player on each team, which is why Doom got reworked. Why on earth was this guy allowed to even exist is beyond me. Since there were less damage mitigation as a whole, he would also very reliably bully the now Soul tank by spamming secondary fires at the perfect distance where almost no one could challenge him. And yes, this is mostly purely a rant segment, but I can't stress how poor the game quality goes when there is one of them. Worse, when you have two in almost every game, with only Orisa being a somewhat reliable answer at that time. If this isn't proof enough that he's just a poor design, I don't know what it is. Thankfully, Blizzard rather quickly recognized this by removing his one-shot altogether, and now he was the worst tank in the game. A simple damage nerf led him from top 1 to bottom 1, and with a rework finally announced to be released at some point, but in the meantime he would stay in the garbage can. Like a year later, this rework would actually come out to essentially how he is in the current time of the making of this video, with the goals to make him a better frontline presence without pushing his damage to one-shot again. They would also reduce his sharpness and make him more reliable by adjusting his abilities, removing his secondary fire and adding a trap. You probably know how he is currently, but the most important points are that his vape would now be on a meter, which meant he got less countered by hard CC and nade, as he could stop and heal later on. His secondary was removed in favor of combining his shot into a more consistent version of his secondary fire, allowing him to deal consistent damage at short and mid ranges, without those extreme scenarios where you would get annihilated by a perfectly spaced secondary. He now has a trap instead, which was added so he could potentially one-shot if he set it up prior, leading to a bigger window to get out of Hog's range, while also adding another layer of utility, as the trap would have a small knockup and a slow. Now, if you read these changes in theory, yeah, he should be much less toxic for the game now, while being more reliable and having more utility. And even in practice, for the first week or two, you could say that. Hog players would play around his trap in different ways, he didn't feel forced to have a critic on his team to be tanky, and he couldn't one-shot as reliably. The issue came with time and with Blizzard's balance changes. He was weak when the rework came out, so in which way did Blizzard buff him? By making his self-healing so strong he became unkillable if you didn't have an Ana. I just can't. His frontline presence was simply to not die ever again and leave his allies to their dooms, as he still had no movement at all and had no damage mitigation for his allies, or any form of pressure that wasn't hooking people. So yeah, Roadhog still fell down to a simple question: can he hook people? The exact same question we have been asking for 8 years. He also became very popular with the rework, and guess what? It wasn't fun at all. His trap very quickly was figured out with the only way to actually use it to put it on your feet near a corner and to wait till someone comes by to be one-shot. Why? Because traps, unlike games like Valorant, simply do not function in Overwatch, and this cheese playstyle is basically the only thing you see Hog players do to this day. He would later nerf the tankiness, and guess what? He was terrible again because he provided zero value besides a cheesy one-shot, and Blizzard has actually confirmed that they intentionally plan to leave him his way, I guess forever. Oh, and if you think we're finished? No, cause it would later make a lot of heroes have reduced HP, which made him able to one-shot without the trap. To be fair, this is against mobile heroes who can try to dodge his hook in most scenarios, but still we're just pushing Hog into the exact same problems again. If you weren't playing Dana, he was unkillable. If you were, he realistically couldn't do much at all. Perks somehow made this issue worse, as his options are that waiting for him to reload isn't an answer anymore, since Hook would now reload, and what if he was even tankier thanks to the cheesy trap? Bans were also terrible, as he isn't popular enough to get banned, but the Hawk player can easily influence his team to banana and some tanks that counter him and made it hell for the enemy. If you play Overwatch right now, you probably know this feeling, especially if you play 6v6, cause for some reason every Hawk main is addicted to that format. Heck, the games I play for footage illustrate this perfectly. I will never die unless I'm hit by an banana nade, and when the enemy starts counter-picking or mirroring my Hog. If you play Hog, this isn't a direct jab towards you, but he simply needs a full rework. I do believe there are ways to retain some of his identity while making him healthier for the game. Now, for proposed changes, they actually took some time to decide, but the overall direction is to reduce the power of Hook without straight up removing it and retaining his overall identity. Rework his trap and change it to something that allows him to provide something outside of his hook while shifting the mitigation from his vape. Remember that the exact number changes don't really matter as much and are mostly to shift power around from certain areas. For base stats, just replay 150 HP to armor. I know visually doesn't make much sense, but if Mauga is allowed to have some armor, so does Hog. Since I'm heavily nerfing his healing, I want him to be tanky in other places, giving him some armor is one of them. For his weapons, simply reduce the overall spread by around 10%. No, this would not allow him to one-shot, as I plan to change how Hook works as a whole, so he can now have more reliable pressure at mid-ranges. For his vape, reduce the total healing duration from 2.5 to 2 seconds, increase the damage mitigation from 40 to 60%, but reduce the total healing from 450 to 250. And as a new effect, if you spend over 50% of your vape, you will now gain a movement speed buff at the end of it. This would allow him to actually have some tempo and other forms of survivability, while allowing him to have a gap close to ult. Again, don't worry, I plan to rework his hook. For the other changes, it would mean two things. He will spend less time vaping overall, as he currently straight up spends too much time self-healing rather than actually providing any value, and letting him have a strong damage mitigation tool that isn't so heavily reliant on self-healing, flattening his matchups overall. His hook would get two major changes. First, the cast time will be increased from 0.3 to 0.4, not a huge nerf, but it should allow the lesser good people to react with defensive abilities, as he will now have more tools to make Hook more reliable. If you get hooked by Hog, rather than instantly pulling you towards him, you will remain hooked, slow by 50%, and get pulled a short distance twice over 2 seconds, inspired by how Hudson Ultimate works in Supervive. All of these effects reduced on tanks on 5v5, so he can't just bully them forever, but now you're able to shoot and use other abilities while Hook is active. With this change, Hook can be less warped into his kit, and allowing the other parts of it to be better, while still retaining his identity. If you get hit by it, you're still very likely to die, as you are heavily CC'd for 2 seconds and you're still getting pulled towards Hog and his team. Even if Hook is still OP or frustrating, now you have multiple number levers to move around if needed. Is the pull too weak? Can get buffed. Is the overall duration too long? It can be reduced. It isn't just the cooldown that one-shot or doesn't one-shots afterwards. The cooldown would also go from 6 to 8 seconds to balance things out with the other buffs. Now, his trap would technically remain as the same ability, but will no longer function as an actual trap, as I already made clear my stance towards them. Now he will shoot it with a much higher max distance, similar to how his old minor perk allowed, but will now activate after a short duration, creating a slowing zone which would be somewhat bigger than the one currently and dealing damage over 3 seconds. Similar to Ram's Vortex, only that bigger with a small cast time and without the pull effect. The cooldown and damage could easily be changed, but as a stipulation, 10-second cooldowns and 90 total damage. First, this would allow to provide consistent utility outside of his hook, creating a zoning or setup tool for himself as his team. Although it will be hard to ignore initially, it no longer has instant damage, so it's mostly a zoning tool and setup. In the case where you do get trapped in the middle of the zone, You will slowed, which would allow Hog and his team to pressure you, or the Hog to land a hook reliably since you're slowed. The damage over time of the trap should go quite well with the new hook, as it will ensure that the target gets hit by a big portion of it. For his perks, and I know they change constantly, but replace the trap miner with something else. It's really toxic and not fun at all. The others are fine overall considering these changes. So what do you think? Do you believe Hog can be saved or that he needs a full rework? I read it in the comments and hope to see you next time.